That's my read of it. Is the argument that kind of the renewable energy is rolling out under its own economic steam. I think that's dead now. Like, because we literally have a subsidy mechanism which is express purpose is to just go out to market and say, tell me what we need you to pay you to underwrite for you to build this amount. So the idea that this kind of renewable energy transition is running under its own steam and the economics point this way, I think is just blatantly falsifiable.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest, Aidan Morrison. Aidan, we last catched up in October when you had freshly released your video. You were, I guess you still are, the quixotic quant at the time. I introduced you as the lapsed physicist turned entrepreneur blogger. You've run a restaurant, you've owned a restaurant, operated that. You've had a pretty eclectic past, and a lot's changed since we last chatted. You are now the director of energy research at the Center for Independent Studies. I try and tune into Australian media when I can, and I'm seeing your face popping up quite a bit on the big news programs. And you've been knocking out these reports. May 2nd, the 6 fundamental flaws underpinning the energy transition. April 11th, how to build low-cost nuclear, lessons from around the world. So figured we'd get you back on and get an update. Of course, you can inform us about the nuclear debate in Australia, how that's developed. But first, it's good to have you back, man.
Thanks, mate. Really good to talk again. It's been exciting time. So
I feel almost like, there's been kind of more happening in Australia than Canada. And, we had, really rapid succession of announcements last year with the refurbishment of Pickering, with the announcements around the addition of 4,800 megawatts of large nuclear up at the Bruce station. Not one, but 4 small modular reactors being planned now for the Darlington station. We have a new energy minister who's, even more bullish than the last potentially. But the news cycles, it's summer, it's slowed down a little bit. Whereas in Australia, things are heating up. So maybe it's because, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But, I pay attention to what's happening in nuclear, and I just, ping, 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 the alerts are coming in from Australia. So catch us up a little bit, mate.
Yeah, sure. Things are heating up. Things have been very live on the nuclear front for quite a while. It's been, all this year, nuclear has been a topic that the coalition, which is the opposition party at the moment, have said they probably would, or they've been talking about nuclear a lot. And so it's sort of been known that they would be probably making this a policy announcement, but there's sort of a particular inflection point when they actually commit to it and make it their policy and sort of announce what it is and in a little more detail. And that happened just a few weeks ago in Australia. So the intensity rose quite a bit, I think, after that happened. But I suppose that also that inflection point marked a particular choice that the coalition has taken, which is somewhat surprising in my mind, because initially, I suppose everyone was talking about nuclear, and there's so many good reasons for having nuclear power. But in Australia, it's actually banned, and so there's a really easy step that is sort of almost unopposable to say, well, let's just you don't need to ban it, right? This stuff is not dangerous. It's very safe. It's proven elsewhere. Can we at least just lift the ban? And that's one particular angle that a lot of people, including very pro-nuclear people, have taken, is that maybe they'll just announce the policy to lift the ban. That didn't happen. The coalition decided to go for a much more bullish position and said not just they would lift the ban and see what happens and think about it later. They said they would lift the ban, and they would also commit to developing a state-run corporation to support nuclear and commit to building at least 2 power stations on 2 of 7 sites that they've announced as candidate sites. And so that's multiple steps further forward, right? They've announced particular sites, 7 that are eligible candidates. It's been interpreted by the press widely as being 1 reactor at each of those 7 sites, but actually they said it was 7 candidates, and they'll commit to at least 2 stations immediately, and there could be more. And they've sort of ruled out all the other sites. I think that they were trying to basically just rule out it being anywhere and say that it would be at these places, potentially these places, but much more bullish kind of take, a much more specific target. And the risk they've taken is that they would get a huge backlash from the places that have been named. but they just named coal power stations as the eligible sites, and that backlash appears not to have materialized, or not been very strong. And I'm certainly getting requests from communities close to these sites to come out and do information sessions and help to inform the local community about the advantages of nuclear and that sort of thing. So the backlash hasn't come. And also, by saying it's a government-run entity, I think that the coalition has sort of immediately answered a whole bunch of other easy objections, like, oh, well, how would it be insured? And what private company would ever back such a thing? And like those things. They've just sort of taken on all the risk and potentially a lot of potential resistance from their own internal party, right? Like, they're the party of free markets and kind of, trying to keep things liberal. So by saying we're going to have the state-owned corporation doing it, they've bitten off a bit of internal kind of risk and discussion about whether it should be state-run at all, whether it's too much state intervention. But it's totally quashed this question of could it even happen and who would invest in it, because they've said, no, the government is going to do this. Remarkable sort of uptick in the intensity of debate that has occurred after that. But the response from the other side is kind of even more remarkable, because within the first day or so, like, what happened is that a whole host of MPs, et cetera, were straight back onto Simpsons memes of three-eyed fish and kind of like, barrels of green sludge and floating little green rods in the water of a kind of a picturesque town near a coal station or something like that. So it's kind of, it went from the kind of a very serious debate immediately to kind of a very comical, farcical kind of scare campaign on the other side, which is, I think, surprising. And I think that it's taken a few weeks now, but literally yesterday, there's an article about the opposition leader basically saying enough with the Simpsons memes. We need to have a serious debate now. This is potentially counterproductive. And I think it largely was. I think that Australians have realised that serious debate doesn't consist of Simpsons memes, and they can't stick at that. So it's got to a really interesting position now. And I think that the debate will hinge on what people think of the cost and the schedule. That's the last kind of substantial, I think, questions that have been asked. But I'll give you a break there to kind of to question what I might have missed out, because otherwise I'll keep going on a monologue forever.
No, I mean, tons of threads to tug on. I mean, it's really hard keeping track of politics these days. What's left, what's right. The world's kind of turned upside down in a sense here. Certainly I remember catching I can't remember what it was. It was a meeting, I think, of a Labour MP with renewables developers, and, comments that have been made in the past. And we're seeing this in many places around the world where there's kind of an embrace of deregulated markets by traditionally left parties. Renewable subsidies, working with private developers, privatizing large sections of the grid. And then we have now kind of a center-right coalition that is, again, talking about state-owned enterprises, state ownership. These are not traditionally what you associate with each of these sides of the political aisle. So, who'd have thunk it? And you mentioned there's sort of some tensions within the coalition on that basis. It was interesting. I think you produced a really important report looking again at this question, how to build low-cost nuclear. It's filling a gap that's not there. And I think, it's hard to say the timeline of it all, but I can't help but think maybe just think so highly of you, but that it has some impact, frankly, because that's, again, it's just not in the political instincts necessarily. And there are other models of nuclear. I don't think they're as realistic, but the private market can take care of this. The SMR craze that can kind of work itself out with private entities. These are just kind of like gas plants, like those sort of category errors. So definitely interested in your kind of take on this upside down, topsy turvy world of the kind of political values and how they've sort of almost swapped sides here.
Yeah. Look, I think it's good overall. I think it's good quality when I suppose sort of those tribal instincts and kind of philosophical alignments don't bind parties so tightly that they can't consider the merits of sort of the other side's kind of traditional position and sort of think about embracing the market where that works well, and think about considering state interventions when the market clearly fails. But I think it's a big ask. I mean, I did sort of write that report wanting to think about kind of, did want to pop this assumption that the private market could, always will work well for nuclear. Because when we looked at it, look around the world, it's almost never been attempted. Like the United States is the only place in the world where a kind of like literally pure private market kind of initiated, and it was their second reactor. Was at Yankee Row, like the most remarkable. In fact, I think it's still a high water market of kind of private companies coming together and saying, let's build this nuclear reactor here and go and get into the design and shopping that. Everywhere else in the world, it's either a case of sort of regulated monopolies, as in like, utilities that have some sort of regulated kind of, you will be the seller of electricity here, that they go and support building the generation too. So they have access to kind of an uninterruptible regulated cash flow, like, or it's state-owned company, like the EDFs and the Rosatoms and that sort of stuff, and the KEPCOs, or largely state-owned. And you can have bits of private ownership too, like KEPCO's 49% privately owned, but 51% government-owned. So we just looked around the world and kind of like, sorry, but the private enterprise in nuclear is the exception, not the rule. And when you look at all the places where it's worked well, and the things that we observed where it works well, when you build lots of the same design in the same country, but also at the same site, like, that's it comes down to it. There's little one simple rule that you shouldn't break, and just don't build these things in ones and twos. Like, if you, particularly when you're starting out the first time, if you decide you're going to build one or two of something, I just say you've guaranteed that you will stuff up nuclear. Like, this is the one thing you can't do. And the UAE has shown that perfectly. Like, they looked at it and they thought about 3, and that was not enough. And they went and decided that 4, and they sized the site for 6. And it's worked out relatively well, because if you kind of have that scale, then it's okay to take your time and say, I'm going to learn the lessons properly on the first one, and have a defensive, very careful approach, because spending more on the first is okay if you're building 4. If you're only building 1, then all the pressure is on trying to get that one done, just like to nail it the first go and have a lucky kind of strike. So I think that all those arguments sort of pushed you into this needing huge scale, and the most economical development is not a 1 or 2 or even a $10 billion, but a $40-50 billion investment that the whole grid will then kind of like, I suppose that kind of thing would last for 100 years. It's such a market. It's like creating your own hydro catchment, right? Like, it's kind of literally, you create this thing that produces low cost power forever, but it's a massive scale that makes that possible to be low cost for, forever. So I think it's natural the government would have to be involved in at least backing that enough to make sure the right scale at the right place and the right commitment to a single design gets in there. So it's great to see that. I think that, that's been picked up. And the other thing is as well, is that I just think that someone mentioned this to me about gas. You can't unban something and expect the market to ever jump into the gap. It's impossible to unban. Like, once you have said that you're willing to and would have a ban on something, you should assume that everyone will be reticent to leap into that space. You've sort of poisoned the well forever, in that sense. And that's the problem we have with gas at the moment. Like, government saying, oh, maybe we will unban this type of gas exploration or development here. No one comes back. Like, they've been scared off properly, right? It's a competitive market out there. So unless you're willing to have the government kind of drive the investment and really take some risk and put some skin in the game to bring people back, I think that the critics on the other side to say that a private company would not invest in this are quite right. Like, that's probably the case. That doesn't mean that the whole society should be left bereft of nuclear forever. It just means that that government's required in leading the initiative to get it done at this scale. So anyway, I'm glad that the traditional lines of politics haven't bound people so strongly that they can't consider changing that.
Right. A former Decouple guest once said, man is blind until he has a metaphor that allows him to see. And it's tricky to find apt metaphors for nuclear. It's unique in a lot of ways. But I have found, again, when talking to policymakers, that comparison to hydroelectricity, at least in terms of that idea of the construction risk, the high capital cost, goes a long way to explain demystify the phenomena, and the idea of private sector companies coming in to fund a gigawatt scale hydro dam. It's hard to imagine. I haven't actually looked at the history there, but I think most of these, again, have been constructed under similar levels of state planning and ownership, or at least big vertically integrated monopoly utilities. So certainly there's some challenges that have been identified. it's become such a culture war. It's so hyper political. This is a liberal representative democracy. Governments change hands. Um, what are some of the challenges that are being identified, and what are some of the ways you think that they can be managed? I guess I'm pointing to the one of sort of political instability, and if this becomes such a line in the sand and partisan issue, one worries a little bit about being able to carry through with a nuclear project if the coalition holds term for a couple governments. These are long term projects.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really good question. The question of the culture war. Look, I think that's really interesting, but I think that is the way that certain people choose to portray the issue and the way it appears superficially in the press. But the Australian political landscape is not like the American political landscape, right? Where I think that in the case of America, this kind of partisan divide and polarization, it really does split people down the middle, and you've got people that are kind of really strongly kind of democratic or progressive, and then really strongly kind of reactionary, kind of right, wanting to sort of support the likes of Trump. Australian politics, I think, is not like that. I think that you have a 70% of the population that is sort of relatively disinterested in politics and not particularly passionate or tribal about it. I think we have a fairly big swinging voter block, or kind of loosely affiliated block that aren't really championing the bit and passionate about it. However, the people that are commenting and the writing that's done by the very engaged, kind of very committed parts of society, that's sort of 15% at each end. They're the ones that are loud. And I think that when you have those guys engaging in the press, it sort of seems like you have this kind of extremely sort of tight, nasty sort of culture war kind of thing. But to be honest, I think it's still fair to say that the majority of Australians, they're not in this culture war. They just like this kind of polarization. They're not avid political followers. They want things to work, and they want to get on with their lives, and they've got better things to do with most of their time. They'd rather watch sport than politics, right? And the guys that in Australia that watch politics, they watch American politics because it's better viewing,
Yeah.
more exciting, right? So it's kind of, I just think that it's a misread of Australia to say this has been brought in and is just being prosecuted, or it's just about a culture war and it's going to be fought on that sort of lines. It appears that way because of the way that it's the extremely engaged kind of bits that are fighting in the press about this, right? And I think it's worth mentioning, kind of, I suppose, some of the politics about Peter Dutton and the Liberals that have brought this kind of in. So Peter Dutton is in the conservative kind of faction of the Liberal Party, he's sort of on the right of he's on the righter edge of the right wing party. And he's held posts in government, such as in immigration, and I think probably held some pretty tough lines on stopping boats and sort of things like that, which, by the way, every immigration minister on that side of politics, which has been a lot in the last years, has done. So, but his background is a policeman, and so he's a tall guy. He's got sort of no sort of natural smiling kind of charismatic charm or good looks. Like, people say that his head looks like a potato. The other side has called him Voldemort at one point. But he's presented by the people who are on the left and progressive as being this kind of arch conservative, kind of dark, brooding, kind of stern to grim kind of character, really unkindly. And he doesn't have like natural kind of, sort of charisma and charm oozing. He's portrayed mostly as looking like kind of stern and concerned at best in the press. There's very few photos from around of him sort of smiling or looking relaxed. And the other thing that happened recently this year, right, which I think tells you a lot about what's happening in the kind of this kind of verge on the culture wars kind of thing, is that there was a referendum held on this thing called The Voice, which was meant to change the constitution to give a permanent separate representation to Indigenous people in Australia, a voice to Parliament, and change the constitution to do that. And this was seen by lots of people in the progressive side of politics as a kind of a really good and virtuous thing to do. There was a statement that came from a big assembly of Indigenous people, the statement from the heart at Uluru Statement, that requested this thing. So it was seen as a kind of like an inherently good, very, very good thing to do by, I think, the progressive. And it was popular at the start of the process. It was very popular. and the government was popular, sort of 60, 70% seemingly support for this idea. And Peter Dutton asked some questions about, a bunch of hard questions about how it would work and who would be voting and sort of what it would lead to. And slowly this thing just slid into unpopularity and got a resounding defeat at the polls. As more sort of details emerged, it turns out the Prime Minister hadn't read the full statement from the heart, the Uluru Statement, and it was connected with a kind of higher level of ambition to do things like get a treaty and movements to pay the rent and have truth-telling, other things that Australians would find a bit harder to accept, like paying the rent and huge financial things. It connected with this sort of activist fringe kind of movement, and it wasn't clear in the end whether it would definitely be a practical thing that would be guaranteed to alleviate sort of poverty and hardship and poor health outcomes, or whether it was simply a symbolic gesture that was meant to kind of and there was a huge campaign as well arguing against it, saying that it would divide Australian politics into sort of separate racial groups. And I think there's sort of a question in my mind too that sort of resonated with, like, for the first time in history, we have just slightly above proportional representation of Indigenous people in Australian Parliament. And so kind of if you start a new separate institution, my kind of question would be like, do the best Indigenous voices go for that separate voice, or do they stay in the main Parliament? And I think there's a lot of and there's an argument I'm sympathetic to say, like, they should be in the real Parliament, having the real, full, unfettered, complete involvement in the system. So anyway, push come shove, Peter Dutton is blamed by the progressive left, who are deeply attached to this this referendum, for killing that. It was absolutely trounced at the polls, 60%, pretty much every state against it. And so Peter Dutton had tapped into some kind of, I think, credible skepticism and held a line there, and it was massively rewarded, seemingly, by the large part of the population. But the left hate him for it. If you talk to the very progressive parts, they just kind of see him as an unimaginable force of evil. And so I think it's very interesting because it looks like culture wars on the surface, but the rest of the country, who are not deeply attached to these culture wars, they will be persuaded by very kind of like down-to-earth ho-hum things about economics and practical things and that sort of thing. And I really disagree with portrayals that this is just a full kind of culture warrior ambit to kind of slam the, sort of react against the left. I mean, this is what Simon Holmescourt wrote as soon as the policy was announced. He said, Peter Dutton has gone full Trumpian. This is the equivalent of saying I'm going to build a wall and make the Mexicans pay for it, right? That's how the progressive left see this, some sort of bombastic kind of like rejection of everything that the progressives support, and it's totally unrealistic and totally uncosted. And I respectfully disagree with that take. He said we're going to start a state-run company to back at least 2 power stations across these 7 sites. And the economics, I think, and we can talk about this more, I think are looking more and more favorable the closer we stare into the facts. It looks very competitive. I could expand on this for hours, but I think that the Middle Australia won't be swayed by those, and only Middle Australia matters. The 15% that allowed us on either side do not matter in this election. It's a question about what happens for that central 60, 70% who have bigger things in their lives than politics. And the questions on the economics and the safety and the reliability of electricity, I think, will be crucial. And so, and if they decide in favour of nuclear power at this particular election, I don't think there's any going back. I think that all the other barriers will quickly melt away. People will realise that this was a sort of relatively silly scare campaign. If there is a sort of resounding vote in favour of nuclear power, that's a big if, huge if, right? But if that happens, like happened for AUKUS, which is the Australian nuclear submarine agreement with the UK and the United States, once that was announced, right, there was a spark of fury from the Greens, but Labor has fallen completely in behind it and is now supporting it in government, as we need these nuclear submarines. And yes, they're safe and they're kind of biting their tongue, but yes, we'll have to deal with the waste from them. So, I think that once that boundary of resistance is broken through, if Australians fall in behind that, I'm not particularly concerned about a flip-flop and changes this way and that, because I think that once that is established, that Australians are behind it, all the economics and the sensibility for the energy system will stack up, and no one will bother trying to fight that battle again, in my opinion. So that's how I see it.
Is this upcoming election like really a referendum on energy, on nuclear more specifically? Are there a lot of other issues on the table? I mean, again, I'm attuned to certain bandwidths and wavelengths here. I have to believe it's about more than that, but it does seem like there's no other country in the world where nuclear is being talked about this much, where a party is, staking their position. I think so firmly. Unpack that
It's a
for
good
us.
question, and there is a clear, crystal clear answer on it. Right? Is that the government that we currently have that is supporting renewables to the hilt and is opposing nuclear power? They said they want this election to be a referendum on nuclear energy. So we have this incredible situation. Literally, the Prime Minister said this election will be an election, a referendum on energy, on nuclear energy, thinking that we should win that election, right? Like, and on this topic. And of course, the coalition has granted them that. Like, we've never had big, tangible policy reform in kind of, I mean, since the Hawke, Keating, Howard era, right? Like, GST being launched by Howard, sort of in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Like, that was the last we've ever heard of major reform. Every election since then has been a kind of small target. They will talk about various topics, but there's no grandiose reform proposed on anything. It's sort of, and it comes down a lot to kind of just who do you trust more as the safer set of hands on the levers that will nudge things a little bit this way. This is the first time we've had any debate that's been in a lead up to an election that has been 100% on substantial policy change, like a reform agenda. And both parties have lent into it and said, yes, we will have this election being a referendum on this topic. So, I mean, there are other topics that will get talked about, right? Like, there's housing affordability is a huge one in their hip pocket. Interest rates are very high. Lots of people are hurting. A cost of living crisis. Like, that's what everyone has said this election will be. This will be a cost of living election matter. But when push comes shove, what are the levers that people can clearly see government has their hands on, right, that can affect cost of living? Even though power bills aren't a big proportion of the total household wallet, they're one of the things that people can understand policy relates to. And so I think even in a cost of living election, which is what it should be, if there's serious policy reform on the table, that will push it to being an energy election anyway, because there's not many other things that the government could credibly do that could massively shift in a way that people understand the costs of living. So housing is the burning one that should have a lot of attention to it. But all the changes that would make a big impact there are difficult, ambitious reform things, and I just can't see either party running a major alternative kind of reform proposal that would have huge consequences on a different topic. Now, particularly since the government tried a couple on negative gearing, which is a tax arrangement, a year or two ago, and that didn't work. So this will be an election dominated by the will and wish of both parties by nuclear energy. It's extremely important, and I hope that the rest of the world is watching. I think it's an important time.
I mean, and we're talking large investments either way. Carrying through with the plans on renewables deployments or on nuclear. What are some of the numbers that are being tossed around? I guess in both camps. And follow up question. I'm just eager to hear how things are moving towards 82% renewables by 2030. Maybe we'll park that as our second question there. But
okay, definitely come back to that second question because I think it's crucial. The numbers kind of that are most often promoted and the whole debate sort of revolves around is this Gen Cost report, which I spoke about and produced that video on late last year.
Large nuclear is in. I have to think that you've had some influence on this year's document.
Yes, I think I and the team at Centre for Independent Studies. Yeah, that's exactly right, and I can tell you that story because it's worth telling. Right, is that previously in the draft in the draft Gen Cost report, which is produced by the way our premier scientific agency, the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation, CSIRO. Right, so in the draft that was released in December, they had the single case from the UAMPS project, the low carbon project that was the new scale design, right? And that was presented about at above $30,000 per kilowatt installed capacity. So, and that project was running. I mean, I'm not totally persuaded about the economic viability of the small modular reactors and that particular design, but that gave us a huge cost. And that was the only nuclear power that it was the only source, the only data point referenced in this entire report for what nuclear power was be. It was this single project of small modular reactors produced by this company in the United States. And I thought it was pretty hopeless. And we submitted submissions, and many other people also put in submissions to the CSRO. But I think the critical thing that I think ticked things over the line is we asked the question because it was cited that in the report that only small modular reactors were suitable for Australia, according to stakeholders and experts. And we asked the questions in one of the consultation webinars of the author of the report, please, which experts told you that only small modular reactors are suitable for Australia? And the answer was, I think a catastrophic embarrassment. They pretty much said that back in 2018, we had a stakeholder discussion. There were no nuclear experts in the room, and pretty much just admitted that SMRs seemed to be the flavour of the day, and they never looked back at it. They never revisited the question. And they've had to admit in this final version that there's no hard technical reason why large-scale nuclear couldn't be deployed in Australia. It faces all the obvious challenges of getting the first project done, and there's the upfront costs of regulating. But pretty much there was nothing behind that. It was just an excuse. They were running with the flavour of the day, and hadn't done no serious technical research to back up that presumption. And they've looked at large-scale nuclear, and their approach they've taken is building at scale, modelled on the Korean design and iterative process, which is very kind, but then scaled up the cost of what the Koreans do for their reactors by the same ratio as what Koreans build coal plants for to what we build coal plants for. And the Koreans, they're formidable builders. We can't beat them at shipbuilding and lots of heavy industrial things. So I think it's a sort of reasonable method, and arrived at a sort of reasonable number, like $8,000-9,000 per kilowatt hour. So a third, like less than a third of the cost that we had just 6 months before as being the only cost for nuclear. So now nuclear, that's the capital build cost, and now nuclear, the numbers that are produced for that start at around $150 and go to $250 per megawatt hour delivered. The bottom end of that band only reflects variation in your capacity factor. It goes from 53% at the highest cost and up to 89%. And so if you consider that a nuclear power plant, modern one, if it's built and operating in mature, steady state, can easily achieve 90%. It's a 90, or the US fleet built in the 70s is operating above 90% at the moment. Really only the very lowest version of the costs of the Gen Cost report, in my mind, is a fair representation of what nuclear would cost according to all their other assumptions. And that is very, very close to the upper bound of the renewable, integrated renewable cost, the 90% integrated renewable cost that they have in their report. So it is at best neck and neck, I think, like when you give an honest appraisal of the fact that nuclear can have a high capacity factor. And then you start considering what is going on with the renewables. And by the way, their report also assumes that nuclear power plants have an economic life of 30 years. So when you adjust for that, right, you actually, again, discounted cash flows, and it's discounted at 6 or 7%, are pretty cruel to the extending the life, but it makes enough of an impact that you get into the band. You're actually definitely kind of neck and neck in the band of what's estimated for renewables at 90% penetration. So the questions remain, and unfortunately here, where we've had these beautifully transparent assumptions, and in fact there's a spreadsheet that you can just change the assumptions and prove all this for nuclear, the costs for integrating renewables are far less transparent. So we know the problems that are there, but it's very hard to kind of quantify them in detail, right? The estimates for storage and transmission and firming, they look too small for me. They're smaller than what I think I could measure by the equivalent comparison to the Integrated System Plan from 2022, which is the reference document they're using. But still, we've asked them to list, for example, all the individual projects they include in that cost, and they didn't. They just gave an aggregate figure, right? So there's still a lot more they could do to make this process a lot more transparent. We also know that the Integrated System Plan uses a model that has perfect foresight, right? Perfect foresight for all the dispatch and construction of every part of the system, right? So in reality, there's no chance that that system would end up being reliable. It's the minimum that gets through if you know exactly when to build every plant and when to charge every battery and when to fill every dam and when to discharge it with perfect foresight. A real system will cost a lot more than that, for sure. And there's been acknowledgements of the perfect foresight issue in the integrated system plan. That's not yet reflected, I think, in Gen Cost. Also, Gen Cost doesn't include the actual plan that we're building. It's an idealized model of what renewable energy could be if you built the best of it. But for example, we are having state governments mandate just projects that have had no economic optimization whatsoever. For example, offshore wind in Victoria mandated 9 gigawatts of the stuff, and that's 3 times the cost of the onshore wind, which Gen Cost assumes will make up the balance of their optimized mix. So we're not building the optimal version, and the real version we're building is going to be a lot more. So I think really maybe I think the top of the renewables band is where the realistic numbers start, and they go a lot higher than that. And the bottom of the nuclear band is where the realistic numbers start, and they go a bit lower than that. And so I think that this debate, and we're trying very hard to kind of produce the compelling evidence and get this discussed and get this sort of stuff exposed. But I don't think that the narrative that nuclear is 6 times as expensive as integrated renewables will survive the next 6 months at all. I think that in the intellectual circles, that debate's already done and over. It's close at best, but getting that to penetrate the news cycle will be a real challenge.
And when you say, just for clarification, integrated renewables, is this talking about the firming of the intermittency? And if so, I remember in our previous discussion, you talked about the sunk costs that were not being calculated and budgeted for, but also that this system depended on a huge amount of home batteries, for instance, which the costs were just assumed to be borne by Australian citizens who voluntarily or not chose to have an EV plugged into the grid or a Tesla Powerwall. Is that still part of the assumptions? I mean, what are some of the potential cost drivers that move renewables beyond that upper band that you're discussing?
Yeah, yeah. It's a good question. It gets slightly complex because there's the other big report and model that's relevant is this integrated system plan produced by our market operator. So Gen Cost is meant to add up the total costs and the levelized cost of energy produced from different sources, including a 90% integrated firmed renewable system. However, the actual model that models what Australia is meant to build and the optimal development path is a much more sophisticated and larger model produced by the market operator. It's called the Integrated System Plan. But that does not add up the cost. It never attempts to add up the full system cost. And that particular model is the one that assumes that we will have about 60, 70 gigawatts of kind of battery power, which is mostly provided by consumer-owned assets, which they don't include in their cost base. It's just kind of assumed to exist, assume that we'll get to 95 or 99% electric vehicle uptake, and 70% of the time people will be charging and discharging at a time that's convenient to the grid and sort of made available to support the grid and not at their own convenience. So the assumptions there are absolutely heroic and I think totally unrealistic, but definitely not free, and they're just not included as a cost in that particular model. CSIRO's report, this time, following the feedback that I was involved in producing that video, they did produce a second set of numbers, right, which are meant to incorporate most of those. And the way they did that is they said, let's try to model what the renewable integrated system would cost in 2023, when we don't have many batteries, in power walls in people's homes. We don't have many electric vehicles that discharge to the grid. So we'll assume what would have to be replaced at grid scale right now. And so they're meant to have incorporated some of that in the 2023 number. Again, I can't see how it's all stacked up enough. And they still exclude, I mean, the key thing to understand is they've used careful language and keywords to describe what they are and aren't showing. And what they say is they're trying to model the cost that would be faced by an investor, not the whole system, not the user. They model the cost to an investor to provide this, assuming everything else in the system is free and available to support that, right? So at the moment, they're basically assuming that, all the other stuff in the system is there today, and getting to 90% renewables can utilize whatever other capacity in transmission cables already built, coal power stations that are still sitting around, perhaps. So that's sort of free and available to help support the other part of the system. And in 2030, they assume that all these home batteries are built. They still have those same sets of numbers with exactly the same flaws. They assume in 2030, all the transmission lines, Snowy Hydro 2.0, everything that we're building in the next 5 years at this furious breakneck pace, which is an important story to get at, is built and is free and available to the next investor, right? And so I think it's a horrendous kind of abuse of the fine print, if you will, because this report, which is looked at as being the authoritative thing to inform a public policy discussion about what's good for the nation and what's good for consumers, um, is actually worded in such a way that that's not what it's fit for. It's meant to only be questioning what would be good as the next step for an investor adding to this system, assuming the rest of what's built in it is free and available, which makes it useless, honestly. Frankly, useless for informing a discussion about what will the whole system cost if you keep building it up in that fashion. Um, but that is a complex argument to get across lots of audiences, and it is still brandished furiously, and I think quite inappropriately by the federal minister, saying, "Look, the science is in. Like, it's science, and the CSIRO have spoken. They find this is too expensive." But that particular scientific report was not considering what the total cost borne by society would be. It is considering what the cost for the next incremental investor would be. In certain cases, if they had to pay for the new stuff that they brought into the system, but not the full cost of what was already put in to support their stuff. So anyway, that's sort of what's happened there.
So yeah, I mean, so how are things unfolding? When I was in Australia last summer, there was announcements of, I think, life extensions at Eraring. There's certainly plans to shut down the coal fleet. How are they progressing? And how's all the transmission, Snowy, the renewable energy zones? How are things sort of progressing in terms of the stated goals
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
transition?
they're not. I mean, that's the short answer across all those fronts. You'd have to say that it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the energy transition is really, um, I mean, stalling at best and running off the rails at worst. So, for example, Eraring, that was long discussed, long mooted as a possibility, right? That Eraring, which is the largest coal-fired power station in Australia, would need to be extended. It was scheduled to be shut down in 2026, and of course, all of the investment justification is being driven. The narrative is very much, look, coal is closing, therefore we must have all these other things built to fill in the gap. And of course, those other things haven't been built. And I think that even if they were, in terms of providing reliability of power, we've had some quite spectacular sort of wind droughts and dark days in the middle of winter just this year. So I think that to fill those gaps, I don't think that the batteries that we thought we'd have on even would have come close to being sufficient. So the New South Wales government has cut a deal with Origin, and it's quite an interesting deal actually. And they've sort of said they will basically support up to around $400 million, keeping these plants going for the next 2 years, and on the condition they're closed after 4 years. The weird thing about this deal is that it actually puts all the control and the choices back in the hands of Origin Energy, the owner of this coal plant. They don't have to accept the subsidy. They can decide prior to the start of the financial year that they would rather just run this plant for their own profit and good. And I think that it's quite, I mean, I don't know whether they'll do that. They might accept because if they get underwritten, there's a cap to their profits, right? There's a chance they don't have to take that underwrite and not have their profits capped. So they might be reading in the lines that it's more profitable than to keep filling in the gaps by keeping this thing running with their profits uncapped, potentially. And the next 2 years afterwards, they've negotiated the ability, without any support and funding, to stay in the market for up to 2 years longer as well. So I actually don't see that as showing that the market is even showing that these plants would be shut down. It's horrendously inefficient for the whole of society if to be run in this ramping situation, providing firming. But it might still be profitable. The consumers would lose out if they can just charge enough through those periods to make that work. But that still might happen. So in any case, the argument that all the coal is coming offline according to the narrative and the timetable is set is completely falsified by these sort of extensions and subsidy arrangements being extended to guarantee that these things stay in for longer. So I don't think the coal is closing. On the other questions, the production of the actual installation of renewable energy at a grid scale, I think that has basically dried up. There was some really substantial reports that were produced by, I think, the Clean Energy Council that said how much has reached financial close and how much was stalled each year. And there was a big pause around December last year when they stopped releasing these new reports. And I think the answer was, and the previous ones had shown that almost none or none had been announced, that more or less the renewables have stalled the new grid scale. And part of the reason for that is that my contention is that it's harder for them to get the power purchasing agreements that pay a high enough price to guarantee their investment. They need to have an offtake agreement that basically underwrites their power. And because we're reaching this level of power generation in the grid now where renewables are starting to cannibalize each other and prices are slumping, the capture price is falling when it's a very good windy, sunny day, etc., it's much harder to persuade someone to pay a high price when you're generating, the power on the spot market is actually quite at a low price. And so to fix that, governments are introducing new schemes to basically underwrite minimum levels of revenue. And the biggest of these is done by the federal government. It's called the Capacity Investment Scheme. The concept to have capacity available is meant to provide underwriting to firming capacity, such as peaking gas plants and or batteries that might help to provide that sort of dispatchable power. But it's been changed in December last year to extend it to basically underwrite many, many gigawatts of new wind and solar generation on top of some of the batteries and excluded the gas firming capacity from it. So it's become basically a mechanism to underwrite enough investment in renewables against natural market forces to hit these targets of 82% renewable generation by 2030. So that's my read of it. Is the argument that kind of the renewable energy is rolling out under its own economic steam? I think that's dead now. Like, because we literally have a subsidy mechanism which is express purpose is to just go out to market and say, tell me what we need you to pay you to underwrite for you to build this amount. So the idea that this kind of renewable energy transition is running under its own steam and the economics point this way, I think is just blatantly falsifiable. If that was the case, they wouldn't be introducing this massive. And we know no cap, by the way. They said there's a cap somewhere, but it's not public. They haven't declared what the maximum dollar value of this subsidy scheme is going to be. So it's just, yeah, I think that's not rolling out either. And the transmission is they're doing their best to force it along. And I think the disastrous thing that's happening there is that the presumption that all the targets are met, which looks hopelessly unrealistic, is now used to underwrite the business case that's used in our regulatory frameworks to force customers to pay for this transition. And I think this is the most sneaky and egregious thing that has been done by far, is that our market operator has interpreted the declaration of targets as being now we need to stop modelling any situation where those targets are not achieved. So the Australian public is being basically forced through the regulatory process to pay for transmission that only makes sense if we do have 82% renewable energy in 6 years' time. And there's almost no chance that in reality will be achieved. It would have to require more than a doubling of the overall rate of uptake that we've had in the last 5 years, which was far higher than we had in the previous 5 years to that. So like no one serious now thinks that will be achieved, and yet the regulatory system considers no circumstance where it's not. It is assumed to be achieved. So we literally have a situation where our regulator is forcing the premature investment in these transmission assets, which is egregious, in my opinion, just absolutely egregiously poor. And I think there should be requirements. In fact, there are requirements in the law to say they're meant to protect consumers from premature and overinvestment. But now, because they've interpreted these targets as just as though they're going to happen, it's guaranteed to overinvest. And I think that Australians haven't cottoned onto that yet. And look, forgive me for rambling, but it's worse than that even still, because the integrated system plan, even assuming that this target will be met, they model, for example, HumeLink, which is the biggest transmission project that's about to be built. It's $5 billion connecting Sydney to Snowy Hydro. They model that as being built in 2029-30, which is exactly the time when all that renewable energy will be built. And they say here, oh, look, now it's just snuck over the line as being beneficial in 29-30. But on the other hand, they've given approval to build it in 26, right? So they've actually modeling it at a time when Snowy Hydro will be online, when there'll be squillions of gigawatts of renewable energy built. And then it sort of stacks up. But they've given regulatory approval. We're trying to give regulatory approval to say you can build 3 years earlier than that. So guaranteed there will be 3 years, even assuming those estimates are built, where it's premature investment. And there's no credible case that it would provide net benefits to consumers in those 3 years. So it's I think it's shocking on all those fronts: coal-fired power stations, transmission, and the uptake of renewable energy. I don't think there's a serious claim that this is working the way the government has claimed it would.
It sounds like there's a lot of variables, a lot of moving parts, and maybe an overconfidence that everything's going to line up on schedule and all kind of plug in. But overall, a very complex system. Now, remind me where we're at in terms of renewables and what the breakdown is, because I understand, despite being a dry continent, there's still a fairly significant contribution from hydro. Like, which part of that, you know, renewables portfolio needs to grow in terms of the wind and solar portion now?
Yeah, yeah. All wind and solar, basically. Like Australia has about 7% of our energy provided by hydro, and that varies a tiny bit, sort of year on year, but it's sort of a little under 10% is what we get from hydro. It's kind of accepted though that all the really good spots for kind of run of river rainfall powered hydro are more or less taken. So strictly, that's not true. There are other places in Tasmania, but there was huge conservation battles, fought and won to protect these kind of World Heritage Area, amazing places like the Franklin River, for example. So, unless you wanted to go and kind of dam very high conservation value areas in Tasmania again, hydro is kind of capped out, and so all this growth from sort of 7 to 82% has to come from wind and solar. And at the moment, rooftop solar is growing and still has been growing quite rapidly, right? So a lot of, I think, the hope and optimism that we can reach these sort of very high levels is built on the assumption that, solar broadly has been taken up, but a large part has been driven by rooftop solar. And again, the situation there on close inspection shows that we've sort of, we've swallowed um, we've swallowed an economic story that doesn't really stack up, which is that rooftop solar is economical, and for household it feels economical, but we've had these incredible feed-in tariffs at various points mandated by different state governments, sort of up to 44 sort of cents still, even higher. I think there's something much higher than that in Queensland, or maybe it's around that, but higher than the retail price. You get fed in for your power when there's too much of it, and so those are still coming off slowly. But also, when you save power by having your solar panel power your home, you're able to save your full usage charge, and your usage charge actually is used to cover the cost of fixed costs in the energy system, like the transmission and distribution network, which your solar panels don't help you cover, and you still depend on just as much. So I think that solar has added up weirdly a little bit more and more the higher that power prices go. But we've got ourselves into this death spiral where, by getting more people onto a bit more solar, the load shape premium gets worse, the duck curve gets worse, the coal-fired power stations we can run less efficiently. We have to amortize the cost of all our fixed costs over a smaller amount of kilowatt hours sold. So it's really a spiral. It's a positive feedback loop which has to break at some point. And we've just had the point now where major distributors have announced they have to start charging people for exporting their grid power to the grid because of the complexity and cost that introduces, as opposed to paying them for it. So I think these bitter truth pills that are inevitable as the economics and the engineering catches up are going to start to come out, and we'll see rooftop solar. It won't become as highly rewarded, even though it's still more highly rewarded than what the actual underlying economics suggest. So that will slow down. I've heard people say, by the way, that the grid scale solar, all the best sites are taken. And that's weird, right? Because Australia has so much space. How can you say the best sites are taken, right? That's ridiculous. But the problem is as well, this cannibalization issue is that, like, now at the moment, because there's so much rooftop solar in the system, the capture price of solar in general is just so low that only the very, very best and sweetest spots would ever make sense. And so it's described to me you'd only really ever throw a line over the back of an existing substation to a solar farm. The idea of building any substantial new transmission to open up new solar is kind of more or less dead on arrival. So I've actually heard that said, like, by someone in a conference, is that, the best spots are kind of gone for grid scale solar, which is incredible, right? Until they're building more transmission for wind, because that has greater diversity and is not yet sort of, fully cannibalized, and the correlation is not quite so intense. But for solar, because there's so much rooftop on the solar system, the grid scale solar is hard to make a case for unless there's already a line right to that spot, which is fascinating. So wind and solar it is, and there's huge battles for that, because the wind has such a huge impact on rural communities and natural landscapes as well. And
I guess building off of that question of social license and delays in deployment, I was actually watching a conversation between you and Alan Finkel, and he was saying, "Listen, maybe we need to be optimizing more for social license and sacrificing sites that have the best actual wind resources in order to get things built faster." It sounds like that would start to affect that kind of upper bar of anticipated costs as well, pretty significantly.
That's exactly right. And look, I agree with the thrust of Alan's direction very much. There is that, like, you have to have a holistic understanding of the benefits and costs of wind, for example. And so, if you're trying to protect the environment, there's carbon emissions is one thing, but also the native habitat that you might be destroying, etc. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm in favor, in principle, saying, like, we have so much space. Why don't we move all the wind, etc., to the places where there is genuinely less social and ecological disturbance, right? And so, I agree with the thrust that direction. But the question is, what does that cost? And I think that Alan's kind of estimate that you might get significantly lower kind of actual quality of wind, and you'd have to go further away, which means building transmission lines further, means that would be reflected in the economics. And so, if you take at the moment the economics we have, and by the way, there was in Renew Economy, which is a very prominent pro-renewables kind of newsletter that's written, excellent example of a wind farm that had, I think, 60 something turbines approved, that planned, and in their application, and on planning reasons for protection of, I don't know, I think amenity or something, 17 of them got knocked back and 47 were approved. And they wrote back and complained and said, the economics doesn't stack up now. We can't get down to $110 per megawatt hour, right? And this is like, this is above the minimum that the full integrated system with firming was meant to be in the CSR report. We can't get down to $110, and so the system won't go ahead unless you give us all those best turbines. Like, we need the best ones. Some of those, we need the scale. We amortize more fixed costs, blah, blah, blah. So the reality is, at the moment, that if you start to try to impinge at all on the freedom of these wind operators to have the very best pick and all as many turbines in the spot they want, their costs for standalone sites, before you factor in the transmission and the firming and the gas and all the other stuff, the inefficiencies that bring to the system, are just on the borderline of not really being economically viable anyway. Shift everything out away from any socially or ecologically contested spaces. I just think that absolutely will make the economics far, far worse again. Like, if it's by 30% or 40%, is what Alan suggested, like, I think in that case, nuclear wins hands down. Like, the contest is well and truly over at that point. If you add another 30, 40% on top of those standalone costs that look like, they're already kind of on the cusp of where they're really not competitive anymore. So I totally agree. I mean, I'd love to see I'm not against renewables if they don't have all these downsides, but they do have these downsides, right? So if you can put them in a place where those downsides don't exist, great. But then the economics doesn't stack up. So I just think those are the realities, those are the trade-offs that you have to be honest about. And I think that Alan raised a valid point. We've got to honestly discuss all those trade-offs.
In the meantime, I mean, I've understood that there's significant investments in gas with the 90% renewables plan in terms of mostly, I think, peakers to ensure system reliability. With coal stations, no new coal stations being built and coal stations retiring, it seems like there's room for gas in the system, whichever way Australia goes. You mentioned there's bans in a variety of states. I'm not sure if that's on production or on actually building these facilities, but where are things at in terms of building new gas plants in Australia?
Yeah, gas is on it is absolutely on the horns of an unresolved dilemma in terms of the current government's today policy about this, right? So, I mean, on the one hand, the government has come round to sort of saying they need to have gas in the system. They announced a gas policy before that said, yes, we need to support. There was a month or so ago, they sort of announced a relatively pro-gas. This is an important part of the transition, which, by the way, the integrated system plan shows that it is. We need to double our capacity for the peaking gas plants, and the actual volume doesn't decline very much, actually, and at certain points it's higher. So it's undisputable that gas is crucial to the planned transition, beyond dispute. And the government had made announcements to that effect. And yet there was a headline, front page of the Australian yesterday, and I got calls and I went and had a news appearance about this, about a taxonomy, a traffic light system for kind of rating investments about how important they were and how useful or counter to net zero ambitions and stuff were, organised by a sort of financial industry body, but funded by the government through this. And they had put gas not even in the amber kind of transition category, but in the red phase out and get rid of it category. And so that was kind of a jarring dissonance, which made the front page of the Australian yesterday, and I spoke about it in Sky News as well. So whether we like gas and are willing to invest enough in it, I think is absolutely exposing the tensions and the kind of, the engineering realities that are slowly catching up with, I think, the renewables movement. And state governments, the federal government has backed building a peaker plant through Snowy Hydro, state-owned company, and that's turned out to be more expensive, I think, than was originally thought. But that's just one. It's sort of a gigawatt-ish, right? So we need 8 times that in the next 10 years, and there's nothing that seems to be on the cards. The capacity investment scheme won't invest in it. The capacity factors of these things will be tiny if the renewable targets are met. So it's sort of acknowledged that the market can't have confidence to invest in that under these circumstances. And there's also the other problem at the moment of getting enough gas supplied on the east coast of Australia. Like, Australia is in this weird position where we have these most massive gas export capacities from the northwest Australia and also in Queensland. Like, we supply we're one of the biggest suppliers of natural gas in the world, and at very competitive, good global prices, right? But with the consumers of some of the most expensive gas, because when those agreements on the east coast were signed for those huge export, the government didn't make any sensible reservation policy and say that this fraction has to be for domestic sale. So the companies building it sold the full volume years in advance. They sold the full volume at a fixed price to the foreign customers. So we've got oodles of gas going overseas, and we struggle to supply enough of it in the domestic market here. And states in particularly Victoria have sort of banned onshore gas, any unconventional gas, so anything that involves fracking. And there's been other bans. There was a blanket ban actually at one point, I think, on sort of onshore gas. So these governments that have made it very, very hard for any new development of onshore gas in Australia have resulted in the situation where we now have potential shortfalls and certainly high prices. And now we have Twiggy Forrest, like the iron ore billionaire, who's building an import terminal, right? So I think he's seen the writing on the wall and knows that there is potentially we'll need to be importing gas into the East Coast
as LNG.
As LNG, and then regasifying it and selling it into our East Coast market. So
is that because the pipeline capacity doesn't exist to move it to the areas where it'd be required, or is this just because of the way?
Well, from the Northwest Shelf, yes. Then we just can't move it from this is like it's you're from a big country like Canada, but this is countries away, right? So it'd be and from
that goddamn Mercator projection that for all of us in the Northern Hemisphere, Australia looks like it would comfortably fit within half the US, but we forget what a massive continent it is.
It's huge. So no, there's not that capacity, and so we look like we're going to start buying off at export prices, like gas that's been got from someone else's wells and liquefied and then regasifying it here, which guarantees pretty much expensive gas. And I think the real issue here is that feeds absolutely into the interests. Expensive gas feeds into the interest in the business cases for renewables, right? Because if your firming capacity, if every new bit of renewables displaces an expensive alternative generation that is marginally expensive for the next increment, then that just bumps up your the business case, right, for your investment, right? You can say, oh, we're saving the public money because we're saving this expensive alternative here. So expensive gas is absolutely critical to the investment business case for renewable energy and all the transmission infrastructure as well that supports it, right? Like cranking that handle just means you can claim you're saving Australians money because it's, the base is going higher and you're sort of, you're chipping a little bit off a, increasingly higher cost alternative. So it's a really a huge conflict of interest, I suppose, in trying to poison the development of any economical domestic gas in the southeast of Australia, and rely on expensive imports, because that will create the illusion that will flow through to regulatory instruments, actually, in a technical sense, of what renewables can provide, and it'll result in a much, much higher cost system overall. But it will definitely put wind in the sails of the investment case for renewable energy by keeping gas expensive. So yeah, it's a huge issue.
So Aidan, we got to wrap up for now, but I want to put you on the spot for a second. I'm a huge fan of Aussie slang, and to me, what you're describing sounds like a bit of a hot mess. But I'm hoping to find a more illustrative term from the arsenal. How
Oh
would you
yeah,
describe the stormy
yeah, yeah.
waters that you may be headed into?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's slow motion train wreck. That's
Okay.
one of my favorite ones, right? Like, it's just that the wheels have been set in this motion for a long time, but we're just starting to sort of roll off the rails, right? So, yeah, it is not just what has come about in the last few moments, but the commitment to it that now the current government, the commitment to this, 90 plus, nearly 100% renewable system has been dug in, like, because there's opposition to nuclear being fought in this next election. And so we are having this fierce commitment to what was always an unsustainable track being exposed. And I think that tension there is just remarkable. And we'll see what happens in the next few months about how what else is exposed. But yeah, slow motion train wreck that is just, I suppose, getting to the pointy and faster part of what a train wreck looks like is sort of maybe the way I think I'd describe it.
All right. All right. We'll have to leave it there, my friend. I'm actually going to be coming out to join you in Australia in a few months' time. So I
Can't
look
wait.
forward to dipping my toes back in the waters out there.
We can do
Aidan
another update
Morrison,
in a few months.
let's do it. Let's do it. Thanks for coming back on Decouple.
Thanks, Chris.